All right, we're all good now. So if you can stop your chit chat, that'd be great. So this presentation, oh, just a second, let's actually present. So Throughput is a project that was funded 2 years ago now through, as a pilot project, a one-year pilot project through NSF's EarthCube program. The idea is to bring the W3C web annotation model into a database effectively to start linking between data resources on the web, end user knowledge about different data resources, and ultimately to start to try to link things, for example, publications to databases, to data sets, to student theses, to code repositories, to create effectively a crowdsourced network of knowledge. It's a very broad and general idea. In the Throughput proposal, what we effectively say is, this is a broad model, but the way we conceptualize it is as several discrete elements. And one of those is the Earth Science Cookbook. And so the Earth Science Cookbook is intended in part to, I talk about that. There's no, I'll just stick on the first slide of my talk. Okay. So this is a workshop, and ideally there are a number of things that I'd like to talk about at the end. I'm going to introduce you to Throughput in general. This is a bit.ly link that will go to a Google Doc that talks about some of the goals for the workshop and stuff like that. And I'm going to go to it in a second. That is 2 capital O 8 lowercase 0. No. 2 capital O 8 lowercase o. No, that's a 0. It is a 0. Okay. Fonts. Aren't they fun? W1G. And so if you go there, or you can just copy that URL right up there. So basically, here's the goal. So I'm going to give an overview talk so you have a sense of what Throughput is, what it looks like in general. And in large part, it's talking about our application of the annotation model, the web annotation model. And then some of the conceptualization around how we are trying to link research databases, public databases to code resources on the web. And then what I want, so we've done a lot of preliminary work on this. We've basically been scraping GitHub using the re3 data markup or metadata for research databases, and then searching GitHub for any instance of a code repository that mentions any one of these research databases, and then linking them through this network. So basically, I'm going to introduce that. The main things that I'm hoping to get from all of you is feedback. We're going to look at some of the examples of what's actually in the database. But then I'd like to talk about what are the things that we would want out of this database. So if you are an end user, we're going to put ourselves in the shoes of an early career graduate student or an early career researcher, and think about what it is they would be looking for, what it is that would give them value in terms of obtaining data out of this research, out of this database. And then thinking about, how do we start trying to fill the database with other examples of data? So not just code examples on GitHub, but things from WordPress blogs or other things like that. And so I'm going to just hop back to the presentation. And so the motivation behind Throughput, really it sort of has 4 key things that we're trying to do with the database in general. One is to manage data entropy. We want to provide avenues for credit for individuals. So it's another way of linking data back to publications in a post hoc manner. So once that publication is out, and helping to link data in large synthesis papers where maybe data citation practices haven't been followed well. We want to also democratize cultural knowledge about data, and I'll talk about what that means, and then support equity in technology access. So throughput is a graph database. It's currently implemented in using Neo4j. The basic data model follows the W3C annotation standards, and we've done some work on documenting that. How do we actually translate those RDF triple stores into Cypher queries into the language of the graph databases? It uses a Node Express front end to manage, back end to manage an API. And then we're using ORCID OAuth. So effectively, it has the capacity to be a crowdsourced system using ORCID, so we refer to it as credentialed crowdsourcing. And then the resources are all linked using specific URLs, URIs, we could be using DOIs, whatever, and text annotation. So this is what it looks like effectively. In this case, we might have a data set that data set URI over there. So that points to a data set endpoint on the Neotoma, from the Neotoma database. It's a landing page. We happen to know that it was used in a publication, but that publication didn't cite that data set specifically. So someone comes in and makes an annotation. The user makes the annotation, and in the annotation body, they say the data set for Hale Lake was used in this paper. So now we have a link between the data object, the publication, a user who may or may not be related to the data set initially. We can scrape metadata because in the case of Neotoma, there is JSON LD on all those landing pages. We also know how to use the Crossref, or we potentially know how to use the Crossref API. So we can gain additional metadata from those remote organizations, or those remote links. We can also gain information from ORCID, but fundamentally throughput itself is set up really to think about these networks and these links. So it's not storing all that additional metadata, it's really just storing those URIs and trying to make sense of that. To manage data entropy, one of the important things is that through the life cycle, I don't know how many of you have seen this Michener paper, but through the life cycle of data, we know the most about our data at the time of publication, potentially before publication, given the long turnaround in the publication cycles sometimes. And so over time, we have this loss of specific details. What throughput can do is, if you have other people who happen to know about a data object or sets of data, they can actually come in and make a new annotation on the data object and they say, well, you know, some of that information has been lost since publication, but then I happen to know that that site is right beside a parking lot. And so I make an annotation on the data object that's in the throughput database. It's accessible by searching on the dataset ID. And all of a sudden we can sort of push up that entropy curve because we can increase the information content of those data objects, or the information that's associated with those data objects. For assigning credit, we can go back to this example. We can link these two things and we can get that information. Data democratization, because science is also a cultural practice, oftentimes information about data sets or methods are really highly focused within certain lab groups or at R1 institutions where you have access, like personal access to different researchers. The idea here is to make some of this information available to a much broader public by linking to it in a direct way. So one thing that could happen is a grad student who's working on and heavily using a single data resource can actually be making annotations that would then be available to any subsequent grad student. And it wouldn't have to be direct communication that's being done. These annotations would be stored. The other thing is that by pulling this into its own data resource that's accessible over the web, we also have data democratization. across data resources. So we know that there are some very big databases that have the technical capacity to manage these kinds of annotations internally, but there's also lots of really small databases like the East African charcoal database, where it's a database, but really it's a spreadsheet. It's managed by one person. We don't know how long that's going to be managed for. This gives them the capacity to at least access some of that additional, technical capacity. And finally, for equity, this is where the cookbook comes in. One of the really important things is that, we are good oftentimes at building technical resources. We are not always as good at documentation. And so the people who are then able to pick up some of that technology are the people who work directly with us. Not everyone has that capacity. And so one of the things we want to do is say, well, we have the Neotoma database and we have an API, we have an R package. I've written a bunch of examples. I don't know the full breadth of what people want to do with it, but we can start linking up explicitly the database itself with GitHub repositories, potentially add some extra annotation and description about what's going on in there. And this then makes it searchable. The other thing that it can do is, if this was my thing, that's one thing, and I work for Neotoma, and so that's all sort of centralized on the Neotoma GitHub repository, so that should be searchable, but I don't know everything that grad students have done with my code. And so this then allows us a way to actually start linking that up and looking at other uses. And we'll see an example when we get into the workshop. If we start actually doing a crawl of GitHub and scraping, we can start to see examples of cross-database use as well. So Neotoma has a specific data model. We have specific conceptions about what certain things mean: space, time, temporal resolution, spatial resolution. What happens when you bring that together with high resolution climate data, for example? How do you actually deal with that? We can use throughput to find GitHub repositories that are linked to both Neotoma and maybe like the Prism 30-meter data set, something like that. And then I would be able to see how have people dealt with this in the past. So as a grad student, again, coming in and starting to work with data, I can then see, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I can see how other people do it. And this can help in some ways foster best practices across communities for dealing with multidisciplinary projects. Here's just a few examples of how we actually implement certain concepts in the database. So you might have a data set from a database that then the user describes that specific data set, or a data set is used in a publication and the user describes that connection in an annotation. So it doesn't even have to be a direct use. It could just be like, this is in the bounding box that they studied, but they excluded it for whatever reason. Or you might have, so this last one is an interesting case where you have a data set in one database. So for Neotoma, for example, we have some data sets. Because people use domain-specific databases sometimes, we have some data sets in Neotoma that are, Neotoma is a paleoecological database, so they are fossil pollen records, but then a bunch of other metadata about the same site and associated with the same site is actually in the National Arctic Data Repository. So these are linked, but there's no obvious link to them if you were to just go to the data resources. And so this allows us to then say, hey, these are actually related, and maybe you want to take a look at both things. So here's some examples of ways we might do this. So you might have an expert like Eric Grimm just commenting on a data set saying this is a weird one. Because we get these emails all the time, people saying like, what's up with this value? I think this is an error, and then Eric sends an email to that person, and we're like, well, where's that information going, right? Like, how do we know? How do we get that back if Eric retires or something? One of the really cool things about code and having some knowledge, so for example, so one of the data sets that we've gone through is the ROpenSci packages, where we actually know how ROpenSci is open research group focused on developing R packages for public data sets effectively. And so if we know something about how those packages operate and the data sets on which they operate, we might know that this call to the Neotoma R package, where it's asking to get data sets from a geopolitical region that is the state of Wisconsin, I know that that code is not accessing just, or is not linked just to Neotoma, but I know that I could execute that script and actually identify which specific sites it is operating on. And so if someone were to say, well, you know, I'm interested in Devil's Lake and where it's been used, I could actually point them to this code repository as well and say, here's not just an example of like the publication that Devil's Lake is associated with. Here's an example of all the different sets of code that have actually accessed the Devil's Lake. And so that's good maybe for the end user. It's also really good for us as a data repository, because then we can show how people are using the data. And then these programmatic links. So this is just links to stuff. So here is the program. So this is the cookbook. So the idea is we start to link these resources. And this is a mock-up made at a workshop that we ran last year, by Shane Loeffler, who also is the lead for the flyover country application that some of you may be familiar with. And so the idea is here, if I am an undergrad, maybe I'm only interested, I could go in and use like a subject search or a keyword search. Maybe I could search by database. And I could say, I'm interested in, I am starting a project that is going to use soils data and hydrographic data. And we could pop up from Re3 data or other resources that have been linked, we could pop up the data catalogs that contain those different kinds of data. And then we could use the graph that is built through the annotation engine to actually say, well, if you're looking for code snippets that link, for example, Neotoma and Wikipedia, here's a little snapshot of them. And here's the description, here's some of the README information. And so you could actually then start to say, okay, well, I see how people have brought these together and get that jump start on your project. And again, you can annotate those code repositories in addition to just seeing them. So if you see one and you say, well, you know, the only reason that Wikipedia was popped up is because someone just in a comment wrote, Wikipedia is awesome, I don't know, then that would go on to further modify how that data is displayed. Okay, so I'm just going to skip out of that and I'm going to show you this, which I don't know that I pushed, but so here's sort of what, to get back to this preliminary talk, this is just in our markdown document, so it looks a little ugly. But right now we have 2,301 data catalogs in the database. We're linking to 11,000 distinct GitHub code repositories. This document is linked in that GitHub or in that Google Drive document as well. Does anyone know if so the problem right now is that I can show you how the graphs look, but I can't on this laptop. It's fine. Oh, okay. How do I join? I need to go to the link. That's okay. Well, okay. So we pulled as much metadata out of Re3 data as we could. So here, so let me just sort this properly. So all databases, when they're cataloged by re3 data, have different sets of keywords. So we can search for databases that are linked to key. So maybe I'm interested in genomics and biodiversity or something like that. So I can do keyword searches to actually see these different databases. These are all, so part of one of the other things that we're doing in throughput is really putting documentation first. And so a lot of these queries would ultimately be abstracted behind, you know, an API call or something like that, but we're really trying to show how exactly these would be implemented. We're using, as much as possible, proper, like using schema.org, things like that, formatting things with JSON LD for outputs. Here's some ugly, this is what happens when you don't put your warning set to false in our markdown. I don't know how to do, okay, let's just go. Ah, damn it. Okay. So here you can see, so this is the table of different repositories and then all the different databases that they actually link to. So here is, this is Synergy, the Synergy Scraper, right? And so you can see that in the Synergy Scraper, it makes reference to all these different databases. West African vegetation, whatever. And so this is one of the things that we started encountering, is that people use these different resources in very different ways. And so the Synergy Scraper is probably not the best use case for a graduate student who's interested in doing a research project on Romanian social data and system for Earth sample registration, because it's doing so much else. But it links to, the Synergy Scraper links to 162 different data resources. The Synergy links to a lot, partly just because of the function. Here's Chinapedia, where they have 67 links. But as you get a bit further down, you start getting some resources that link to, you know, there's the open data resources for Gov. I don't know where that went. Anyway. But some of these others start linking to fewer and fewer resources. And so you can actually, there are a large number that link to 2 or 3 different resources and are very much focused on those resources. We can match individual databases, and so we could just match directly to the National River Flow database in the UK and see all the different GitHub resources that it links to. We can look at specific GitHub users, and so you can see that CRAN as an organization links to a large number of different repositories, or has a large number of different repositories that access data from databases. rOpenSci, you can see some others as we go down. So IEDA data. So it's definitely, and like Data One. So some of these are organizations that actually manage data for one specific data resource. But as we go even further down, you can see there are individual users who are actually operating on different data sets as well. So there's me, I know that's mostly Neotoma stuff. And so then here we can actually look at, so I want to actually take an example here. So if I go to, so we can actually, because these are all just URLs, when we look here, so this band R informatics, for example, we can actually look at this and see, you know, why is it that they are hitting so many of these scripts? And so part of it is because they're actually using these R libraries. So this one is not super useful. But here, so presumably the reason is because they were hitting re3 data and outputting a repository list of like all the unique repository IDs. And my guess is that somewhere in here, there's a text document. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is how do we actually make sure that some of these links are useful? How do we curate it without without needing to have actual curators touching all the data sets? Because this again is something that's not particularly useful when you're just searching for stuff. But if we go to some of these other ones further down the list, so, and actually this is another thing that we see quite often in the resources is that here are a bunch of people, so a bunch of different individuals. They have a bunch of different repositories. They're all named different things, but they're all linking to the exact same set of repositories. And so I think in general, so like here, here, and here, and here, oftentimes what those are is probably one example repository that was then forked by a bunch of people, or used like in a class experiment or something like that, or class laboratory. And so another challenge that we have right now is how do we actually make sure that we're not just linking to every single one of them and give sort of the most relevant result. But you can see again, you know, there's definitely interesting stuff in here. There's also a lot of like garbage. One of the challenges that we also wind up with is the fact that people are not very good. Like, you know, we're relying on plain text searching within GitHub because people aren't very good at managing the metadata in their GitHub repositories, right? And so they don't put a description field when they create a new GitHub repository. They're not writing full README files. And so we can use the quality of the metadata in the GitHub repository as a good example. But if you think about, like I'm going to make a general statement about graduate students. If you think about a graduate student, oftentimes learning how to use GitHub is one of the last things that they do because they're being asked to put their code up online and they're not really using it the same way that someone who's doing intensive programming is. And yet they're oftentimes the sort of the people who are really doing that interdisciplinary work. And so part of the way we want to motivate people to do better in that stuff is by really making the link between the number of times that your GitHub repository might be searched or might be cited as a function of the quality of the metadata that you provide. And so there are citation tools that are associated, or at least theoretically associated with throughput, because we can show the number of times and the position of your data set in the searches. We can show the number of times it's been linked to and the number of annotations that are associated with it as an indicator of the quality or the importance of your data set or your code repository as well. So it's just another metric that we can provide, especially to early career researchers, to really say your code matters. Your code matters for certain reasons. Do you want me to zoom that up? It's where for what? Oh, up here? It's linked in here. I think it's linked in here. Oh, it's not. Okay, here. Just a second. This is and if oh right, because okay, here. Sorry. There's the repository. Oh, I'm just going to delete this part though. And I fixed it. I fixed those warnings. I just didn't push it yet. So, there's some related images and there's some things from. So this here is an example of the graph. Go up. So this is an example of the network. This is the National River Flow database. So this is a Europe data archive, sorry, and this is a British data archive on river flow measurements through time throughout the UK. And what you're seeing here is the actual archive in the center. These are individual annotations associated with it. These are all the GitHub repositories where that National River Archive has been referenced in some way. Here's our schema identifier to indicate that these are code repositories, schema identifier to indicate that this is a data catalog. That's Re3 data, the resource registry of repositories. I can't remember what Re3 is, but basically it's a database of databases, or a database of database metadata, and then some textual annotations sort of describing why those are related. The nice thing is that we can do, this is just for anything that's linked to that single repository, but then we can expand this graph out and say, give me the query that will show any data repository that's associated with, or any code repository that's associated with more than one data repository. And so it makes these searches a lot easier. We can use any of the parameters associated with the individual databases and then provide that to the graduate students or to the end user. So I apologize if there wasn't a huge amount in there. So I think one of the questions is, using GitHub is fine, but is there other low-hanging fruit out there? I guess Bitbucket, like using actual code repositories, but is there low-hanging fruit out there with other code examples where we could go links between existing data resources like Data One or other large-scale services and actual code, implemented code that goes beyond the documentation. Because we're trying to fill the database initially, like this is one of the use cases, one of the motivating use cases. And part of what we want to do is try to find as many different examples of ways that that data is produced and potentially accessed. I don't know, does anyone have any other suggestions? Yeah, like where do people put code, I think is one of the questions. Well, so data sets as well. I think right now we're sort of sticking to Re3 data as a provider, in part because it's the databases. The data sets are, yeah. So all we're doing is we're saying that Re3 data metadata is the container that we assume that the data sets are inside of. And so, or like, it provides the link to the actual database. We're not looking to harvest individual data sets for this right now. We're looking for code that does that harvesting. Does that make sense? Yeah, so we assume that if someone is referring in a GitHub repository to the Neotoma paleoecology database, that they are at some point using that to get information from the database at a very naive level, but yeah. Yeah. So
how do you drill into the database then to see, okay, I've got this data set, what repository is mentioned? If you wanted to actually go look at the repo and see what it was doing.
Right. So So I think that that's sort of the next stage. So the first stage is let's at the very top, let's just go to GitHub and start to see what that landscape looks like. And I think initially what we're finding is there's a few ways that people are doing this. One way is people are explicitly going in and maybe using associated R packages or Python scripts or something to actually harvest data from that database using that database's API or web services somehow. Another way is people are putting text documentation on there, and it mentions that database resource. Yeah.
So maybe not code, but it would be a source of documentation that might mention code in your meta level, but like Dryad and
yeah.
You know, there's readmes in Dryad, and the code is probably not in Dryad, but the readmes, because I've actually been doing some diving into what kind of metadata is actually in readmes.
Mm-hmm.
Surprise, surprise, it's pretty thin a lot of the time. Shocking. But they do sometimes, at least the ones I look at in Dryad, sometimes mention this data was scraped from X,
yeah.
or this data is from whatever. So
right.
Yeah, I might think of looking for documentation. So that could also, like, Figshare might be another source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the code in Zenodo comes from places other than GitHub as well, because I know Zenodo is the DO. Okay. Yeah.
The other thing about Figshare, and I've done this for core read data sets, looking to see what Python codes out there, really messy in open source, but Dryad is pretty productive. But the other thing, so those would not necessarily appropriate for a systematic way of doing that, but also in Zenodo, if you've got a data set stored there, then you've got a particular URL that can be accessed. And then if you search for R code that has that
that's
URL,
yeah. So that's one of the next steps, right? And so we started out, so once we know things about the APIs or the URLs for those databases as well, then we can start doing that kind of scraping too. The other really neat opportunity as well is doing sort of a reverse thing where if we find the code and someone makes an annotation that links code, or maybe they make an annotation that just links code to a data set, and we know something about that data set and its relations to like a database, then we can actually build the network and say, well, you know, I happen to know that the URL associated with this node is associated with Neotoma, therefore that code is associated with Neotoma, and I can surface that when you're searching for code resources. Yeah.
really a chunk like that might be sort of easy to harvest and come up with some good quality code as web servers. Is that the same kind of thing?
Right. It's ERDA. Two Ds. Yeah. Yep.
This would be hard to harvest, but sometimes in the self-generating materials.
So one of the other pieces of this proposal. So this is a figure from our proposal. Let me present just this slide. Oh, or I'll just present and then I'll flip through. So one of the figures in our proposal is basically to say, look, like the annotation model is very generalized, and so what we are thinking is there's a database that can contain everything effectively, but then you will have custom input methods and custom extraction methods. And so there is this programmatic deep dive interaction where we believe that we can use GeoDeepDive as a tool to actually extract like code from papers, or, you know, if we can, and so that annotation model looks very different than the annotation model of the scripted GitHub scraper. We're working with the UBC library, specifically their earth science group, to actually go through their theses and say, okay, let's make annotations for the thesis that will link the thesis to published articles from that thesis, because oftentimes the thesis contains extra data. And the theses are all online, they're all scanned now, and so it should be able to then allow people to find that any extra information about those data resources by then going back easily to the thesis, which isn't always cited, right? Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah. AIRE, right? Yeah. Right. So we're also using Antosoft as well as a source. So one of the, because this is an EarthCube project, an EarthCube funded project, we want to be working with things like the resource registry, with Antosoft, with Synergy, groups that have already done some of this work. But the idea is part of what we're trying to do is democratize that network so that then individuals who are working with the data can actually start making additional links to add richness to the network. So, yeah. Right. Okay, I'll look. Sweet. Yeah. Yeah.
So two things. One, Kaggle might be a rich source.
Right. So yeah. Okay, that's good.
Basically, you say, I need this kind of thing done. Here's the data set. Here's the idea. Now I'm going to do this competition where I have like a cash prize or something, and people will grab.
Yeah, because
that idea and run with it.
so Kaggle will host the data sets. Oftentimes the code for those competitions goes on to GitHub, because if you search GitHub for Kaggle, like it's all it's crazy. But
Has, live environments.
mhm.
Run
Yeah.
notebooks or
Yeah.
people have used.
Yeah.
And two, when you're getting into GitHub, one of the things, I'm sure you're familiar with the Hindi Meta project that we did. In that, we were able to find a lot of resources by digging into the JSON for the notebook itself.
Right.
And like reading import statements and seeing.
That's, yeah. So, so one of the other, so the GitHub scraper has, there's different elements of it. One of them is just literally going and just looking for the names of the databases. So we're just looking for plain string names. The other thing we've done is we've started to make a catalog of things like the Neotoma Paleoecological Database has an R package called Neotoma, and the ways that it is called are library Neotoma, require Neotoma, sort of like, and then some of the text strings that would be actually used to call it. And so we do have, we have support from GitHub to sort of get around their pinging, you have to sleep your script, their abuse mechanisms. And so what we're trying to do is to build up a broader repository of the ways that those databases are actually called, or information from those databases are called. So then, if someone has misspelt the database name or something like that, we can also find those use cases. And part of the way we can do that is by first building this data, like this network, and potentially, depending on how big, I mean, we're already at 11,000 different unique repositories on GitHub. Depending, there are ways that we could actually start using things like natural language processing or something to say, like, what are the strings that all of the GitHub repositories associated with this thing, what do they have in common in terms of, in terms of the way that they actually call that database. In principle, I think that would be actually a fairly difficult task because, there are very few data repositories that have more than 100, there are very few data catalogs that have more than 100 code repositories associated with them. And so as like a source for machine learning or something, it's probably more likely going to be graduate student summer learning. So, but yeah. I guess in terms of people's work, or in terms of their work doing primary research, or in terms of their work managing data resources, how do you see or how do you keep track of the ways that people use your resources when they're not directly associated with you? Does anyone have a sense of that?
Hearsay.
Yeah, hearsay. Yeah. So, I mean, I get emails from graduate students often, and they say, hey, Professor Goring. And I say, I don't know why. But they say, I am using the package to do this thing, and I'm having this problem. And oftentimes when I, look at what they're doing, I think I believed at the time that we had a well-documented package, but the more code I see coming from graduate students, the more I'm like, oh, maybe we missed that. But I think, this two-way street there, but I'm often surprised at the uses that people are making of the data, and I'm often surprised at the ways that they go about trying to access the data. And part of the motivation for this as well was so that I didn't have to answer the same question 12 times potentially. And then I started to try to build like a code cookbook, and I was like, oh, this is gonna, like, if you're a graduate student, you're just trying to like scan through all this stuff, it's gonna be crazy. And they're trying to link to data that I had never thought of linking to before. I know, like, do you have students who use programmatically your resources? Any? And I guess, like, how do you see them actually? Like, do you see their code? Yeah.
I don't know if this is historical at this point, but like I've worked with grad students for 20 years or so now, and just I'd say maybe 5-7 years ago, we were in a situation that I think Madison brought up with the code we reference in supplemental materials.
Mm-hmm.
And when GitHub started coming online and people started using it more frequently, those grad students in my ocean science domain who were more regular users of coding, hooked on to GitHub right away.
Right.
And use GitHub's native search, to try to find other people's code around the world, and they get it. But with new students that I have coming on, there's still a barrier in terms of just getting them onboarded to GitHub,
right.
And they're not already coders.
Yeah.
So there's like an iceberg where most of the code that's being done in this long-tail science is on local computers and probably never gets published in any form anywhere and never gets referenced anywhere. And at this point, I'm happy when people in their papers at least acknowledge software being used, but to get to the point where they expose code that's really a data resource is like you're just hitting the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, well, and so that's another motivation here, and I'll see if I can find it. Maybe I didn't include, maybe I deleted the slide. But one of the things that we do is we want to try to have a strong mandate for actually increasing citations of code, and partly to motivate filling the data resource. So we don't ask that people put it directly on GitHub. It just has to have a URL somehow. They can add their own data. We can build, we can have other scripts running in the background that help connect that code or whatever it is that they've uploaded to other resources. And I mean, we're linking to GitHub here because it's an easy thing to pull to. I think that GitHub is super intimidating for people, but it's nice at least that you can see the code and you can connect to it. Yeah.
I'll just throw in, as long as you're doing searches in GitHub, students have always had, access to a bunch of private, repos, and GitHub actually expanded the papers to have private repos. And so some students I know who used to share their stuff now just kind of feel shy about it. So they're stickier, and they may share with other folks in the lab and or in the institution, and they may get an acknowledgement with more private repos.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, there are very valid reasons for wanting to have private repos, right? And I mean, the goal is open science. We might not agree with all the reasons that people have for having private repos. I think that sometimes people have this fear that everyone's going to see their code, when in reality, no one looks at people's GitHub repos unless they have a very specific reason. But all the same, I think that it's really important to try to like, the idea of code citation in the framework of throughput anyways, or of annotation citation, and of building this network, is to really provide carrots for people, is to say that, look, if your data set or if your code is in this graph, we can start linking it to publications, to databases, to things like that. And maybe you do use Neotoma in your code. Those developers from Neotoma can see your code, and potentially they might make a pull request that says, hey, here's a way to make it more efficient and cleaner. And that benefits you, right? It benefits Neotoma because as a data management system, because then we get to see how people are actually using our data, and we can improve our APIs. We can, maybe we see like, oh, this is a really common pattern that we're starting to see in code that uses Neotoma. Maybe we should fix our API to everybody is downloading the data, they're converting it this way, they're like compiling these columns. Because everyone's doing that for whatever reason, maybe we just need to change our API to make it more efficient in the future as well. So there's really like part of what I hope we can start to do is really make this a two-way street as well. And if we see the value from Neotoma, we can start to really encourage our students and our grad students to post their stuff publicly as well, and say, look, like, I understand that you're worried that your code looks really crappy, but that really teaches us something, and that really helps us improve our documentation to say, this is a use case that's out there that we're clearly not explaining very well, and we can write something. So.
You suggest that there are going to be multiple ways of putting information.
Yeah.
And I can think of sort of more unsystematic and systematic examples. People might want to do this, specific institutions, and again, they can continue to build at the edges. But is there going to be sort of structured way for folks to offer a set of linkages?
Yeah. So. So it's a good question. I think that there certainly can be. I think that part of the reason that we adhered, that we started, like, part of the reason our data model started with the W3C standards and existing standards is that it should make it easier for people to basically map that onto an API with JSON LD that can then be translated directly into the graph. We want to think about things as like large scale additions as sort of, or the way that I'm conceptualizing right now is more as sort of a project-based approach, where we say, okay, you are the UBC library, you have a particular data model that you want to start linking these things. Ultimately, let's refine that down to this very specific framework, this metadata framework, where it's, you know, an annotation with a target and a body, and additional metadata about motivations and audience and that kind of stuff, which is all very clearly documented. This is how we then turn it into the API call, and then you can push everything. And so part of one of the other things we've been doing with that in mind is that if you actually go to our, and I sincerely hope that I've pushed this, but I actually suspect maybe, oh yeah, I have. So if you go to the throughput, get one of the throughput GitHub repositories, like everything is in there, everything's public. There is a fairly long, there's a fairly long README file that actually has all the documentation that is not linked in either my presentation or this stuff. But one of the things that I did was I spent a bunch of time going through the WC3 annotations and actually writing out for each one of for all of their examples, I wrote out, so you can link to the actual W3C annotation standards, and then you can go and also see exactly how I implement it in SQL, how I translate that JSON LD element into the SQL query that would replicate that in the throughput database. And so ideally what we then get is that we get a system that more people are able to, so more broadly, sorry, I just want to back up. More broadly, in this repository is all the code that you need to basically replicate the whole database. This is in, oh, there's are you at the repo?
Yeah.
It's in the directory called Cypher Anno examples.
Oh, great.
So it's a direct link to every single example in that. I say every single, but I know that there's some that I didn't get to yet. But the idea is that people should be able to not only replicate the data model of the database, all the scripts that I'm using for the GitHub scraping for loading in the raw data are in there. And so they should be able to like get an instance of the database up and running. Our repository for a front end is also in there. And so really like you could replicate this database now on your local computer. And because we have these examples, potentially it will allow people to add and actually pull and push, make pull requests for new API endpoints that actually directly modify the database. So we want to try to start developing in an open way so that we can ideally have a more sustainable environment, because I can't go out to every group that wants to participate, but I can give you the resources and explanations and documentation to set it up locally to see how you would ingest data, or how data from your resource pool would be ingested into throughput. You can potentially make changes to the API that would facilitate that, or facilitate access to data resources for your domain, and then push that back to the main throughput repository. We could then set that up on the server once we've vetted it, and then all of a sudden you have a portal to your domain knowledge or your domain that uses throughput. Does that make sense?
So you set up a local instance of the database and push annotations into that, and then have as a way to harvest those annotations into.
So you could do it that way. I think more what I'm talking about is they could, so part of the concept here with this is to say, the way that the library thesis repository might set up a front end and like set of API queries to throughput would probably be very different than the way that like a museum collector might want to access it and might want to think about interacting with the database. And so the model that we're proposing is that you could set up a local instance, you could start building some of the API stuff, you could start building some of the front end stuff yourself. For that data ingest, you would be writing a script that would do that. And then once that script is ready, we could put it up on our server and ingest the data in that way, rather than ingesting just a snapshot of a local database. Although we could do that. I mean, that works as well. I think so. And so
basically sort of an annotation harvesting
Mm-hmm.
method.
Yeah. And so one of the other things that's in here is, again, like, is it realistic to expect everyone to know how to build a Vue.js front end and the API back end? No. But what we have been trying to do as well, and I'm really hoping that that's a terrible example. Well, so that's a bad example. Let me just see, because I did one of these. Okay, here. So for the API, which is served using Node and Express, which are JavaScript frameworks, there is actually whole documentation here about how to set this up. And so how to install Neo4j, how to start it up, how to install Node.js. And then it just stops because I haven't pushed the rest of it. But there is a whole bunch of documentation in there that says, you know, here's the framework that we've already got. Here's how you add new endpoints. Here's how you link them to the SQL queries. Here's how you get the information out. And so this, again, is not only the service, but also the documentation written from the viewpoint of people who are domain experts largely and not necessarily software developers.
This is like a scrappy data one for.
Yeah, and so it is entire. Huh? So but one of the things is that, you know, it's not that, I mean, it's certainly not intended to be in competition with Data One or anything like that, because it really serves a different purpose. But yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and so I think that's part of the motivation is linkages are desperately needed. And there's all sorts of different ways. I think one of the big challenges for us is going to be, how do we differentiate between what linkages mean? But in the annotation standards, there's motivation, right? There is a motivation field that has a whole bunch of different classes, and boop. And we've implemented that, and it's likely that we will probably have more. It's in the raw data. So you can see, so like they describe a set of instances. This is implemented in the database as well. Whether it's bookmarking, classifying, commenting, describing, like why are those annotations being made? And it's likely that we'll probably need more classes as we go on. That's an ongoing discussion that we can have. But this is a vocabulary associated with the W3C annotations. So all of the vocabularies that we use are also in here in this raw data thing. You have information about the accessibility features, the different audiences that material is intended for, or that the annotations are intended for, different types of data objects. And so you can look at the code. So I mean, I don't have a huge number in here, but we can add more types because the schema.org schema is huge, and you know, you could have any sort of type that you want. And then, yeah, different, like we have the opportunity to add all sorts of different stuff in here as links to the different bodies, the different objects that are actually being tagged. And so that's why it sort of gets into this idea of different ways of actually accessing the data, because what I might want from the perspective of, so one of the other uses is for Neotoma on our landing pages, maybe I want a little button where if someone knows something about it, they can just hit that and say, I know this about the data set, here's some blah, 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 blah. We also maybe want a button where I can tag it and I'll hit it and it'll say, this is what everybody has known about this data set. And this is all the code examples where this data set is being used. And these are all the publications where this data set is being used. That's very different from a use case where someone might be really interested in accessibility on the web. And they say, I'm really interested in all the databases that have made their landing pages like accessible for people who are visually impaired. And we could make annotations for that, right? And we could make links between read3 databases and the accessibility features and make that available as well. So it's really like the opportunities are very broad here. The main point is that we need to think about how we serve that information up and how we empower people to do that. Yeah.
So is the API for this set up at this point so it can be conceivable to, let's say, have a Jupyter notebook and have a little function in there that would,
yeah,
that would post an annotation from that?
I can put, so I think it's down right now because it was on AWS with the database, and I moved it. We're moving it to the to Wisconsin's CCI, but I just haven't prioritized putting it back up because no one was using it. I was just using it, and I was like, I can just use it locally. It's easy to put up. There is also an R package that I was writing for it too, throughput dbr. And so it has a terrible README file, being a bad example, but yeah, I mean, there's an R package as well that's associated with it. And so there's all sorts of ways to start accessing this. We have throughputdb.com, and I don't actually know if it's running. Oh, yeah, it is. I wonder where it's running from. So throughputdb is actually accessing an online version of the database. I wonder if I can get that. So it is actually, there is a very light version of the database online that I need to update, but it's going in. There's a bunch of visualization stuff. I'm not very good at D3, visualizing, like making the actual network. I'm not like a native web builder, but basically you can search annotations that people have made by their ORCID. That's the login panel up at the top. You can search for different websites, things like have people, I could put in neatomadb.org and see like, here's all the annotations that are associated with it, that kind of thing. And then this is a very basic, this would be sort of the most basic annotation where I'm making an annotation about a specific data element, right? So all I need is my identifier, the URL for the object, some description, and then some keywords.
To create a new annotation.
Yeah, and that would create a new annotation. I could submit that. But I think it's not running right now because the API is down. I think the front end is serving, but I think the API is down.
I have found the Wi-Fi here quite slow.
No, I'm pretty sure that the reason is, but thanks. Mm-hmm. Okay.
She experienced that with me.
Yeah. Okay, sure. That's what the problem is then.
Just roll with it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to help you.
But yeah. So I mean, this was all like, we are still not into the 3-year grant, and so this was all on the 1-year plus extension proposal, and so a lot of the development for that was in sort of the data modeling and thinking about the use cases and sort of building examples of use cases. It wasn't so much building a fully functional system, because I think I wanted to make sure that the groundwork was done properly. So, any other questions? We can get out of here early.
Where's this going to be at the end of your next 3-year grant?
So at the end of the next 3-year grant, the idea is that the database itself will be up and served. I mean, I can put it up and serve it relatively quickly. We have a postdoc to work on the Geo Deep Dive Scraper. So one of the other really interesting opportunities, I think, is that as people are using Geo Deep Dive more and more to produce effectively like research quality data out of legacy publications, the question is like, how do you know whether to trust that? Where does that data go? And then how do you know the provenance of it? And so one of the things we can do is we can actually connect the publications that were scraped with Geo Deep Dive to the actual scripts that Geo Deep Dive used to the subsequent data outputs. And so you could potentially maybe in Geo Deep Dive, they rescan things. Maybe they have better OCR technology. Like maybe there's a new version of Tesseract that then improves the OCR, improves the NLP status of the data in Geo Deep Dive. And so maybe Geo Deep Dive gets better at detecting things over time. And so by making those links, we could actually start to see, can I go back and make this reproducible? Can I just see what documents are actually being linked? And can I know that it's Geo Deep Dive that's actually producing this data rather than an original researcher submitting it, something like that. So we have a postdoc who's going to work on that. Andrea is going to be looking at working with collection managers as well. So at museums, how do we link actual museum specimens to publications that they've been used in? And so part of that idea is, again, to look at the utility, like have metrics for curators to basically say, look, this sample of this bird was used in like 15 publications or something like that. Right.
And also, this was actually a phrase that somebody at Michigan said, not me, unfortunately, so this is core concept that he's talking about was like use super specimens, so identifying the specimens in the repository that have been used more than others, and thinking about what's the spread of citation for a collection. And I think, yeah, so seeing this will both be great for this project, but also
yeah. I mean, and for Neotoma, even because we have mammal fossils, because the use of ancient DNA and pollen analysis is increasing as well, being able to link to things like GenBank, both for the type specimens for different taxa, but then also for the actual specific specimen itself is really important. And you can think of other examples in the ocean sciences as well, other things. And so sort of these links between databases, I think, will be really critical.
Let me just ask, since you guys raised the question, what would you recommending for coming up with specimen identifiers for live organisms, since that's not something else in this so for example, lots of cases with coral organisms that all came from one, and they're in turn into hundreds of replicates that are having experiments done for them. So yeah, exactly. So they're all connected to this one.
That sounds like a great use case.
Yeah.
We should trade cards so we can follow up with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sounds like a great.
Because if you have a system, then I'm happy to get all these specimens into that system.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this is another example of, I mean, Yeah.
Technology network has a system for identifying the forms of rare lilacs, but I don't know if anyone else uses it.
Yeah.
I don't know what, like, I don't know. Research. All the chat sites have an idea of registry. So, yeah, because you said that you had a ton of, right.
Mhm.
The mouse IDs are cycled. The mouse identifiers, the gene subtypes are cycled. But connecting them, all the stuff to the original. Right. Yeah.
All right. We can talk after the session. We can talk once we've warmed up.